Today marks 1 year since Russian mercenary chief Yevgeny Prigozhin launched the most serious challenge to Vladimir Putin in his nearly quarter-century rule. Angered by a lack of ammunition in the war against Ukraine, his Wagner Group military forces advanced unopposed into Rostov in southern Russia on June 23rd last year. From there, they then turned their sights on Moscow.
A year ago, Russia was jolted by the news of an armed uprising. A march led by one of Putin's closest allies. Yevgeny Prigozhin had been complaining for months that the Russian military was denying his Wagner mercenary forces ammunition in Ukraine. On the 23rd of June 2023, he ordered his soldiers to take over Russia's southern military headquarters.
We're at the headquarters. It's 7:30 a.m. Military objects of Rostov are under control, including the airfield.
Prigozhin then ordered his forces to roll toward Moscow to unseat his foes. Blockades were set up around the capital, and Putin's response was swift.
All those who deliberately set out on the path of betrayal, who prepared an armed rebellion, who undertook blackmail and terrorist methods, will suffer inevitable punishment and will answer both to the law and to our people.
An amnesty deal brokered by Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko, in which the mercenary forces were offered a choice of moving to Belarus, brought an abrupt and anticlimactic end to the greatest challenge to Putin's rule. Yet experts say he has suffered very little lasting damage to his authority.
We have not seen kind of the loss of confidence in the Kremlin that we might have expected to see from among sort of the Russian elite and sort of the rich and powerful men mostly around Putin, which might in fact signal that the Kremlin is stronger than we think, right? That it can afford a certain amount of chaos and dysfunction, and yet the core holds solid.
As for Prigozhin, exactly 2 months after his failed coup attempt, a plane carrying him and his top associates crashed, killing everyone on board. The Kremlin has denied involvement.
Earlier, I asked the military analyst Sean McFate if he agreed that Prigozhin's failed rebellion has not affected Putin's grip on power.
I don't agree. I think that Prigozhin, his march on Moscow a year ago showed just how vulnerable Putin was. And it also, let's remember that Prigozhin rode from Ukraine to Moscow nearly unopposed. And afterwards, Putin reestablished his grip on power. But I think the legacy of his vulnerability still exists in the air. So even though Putin remains strong today, I think it showed vulnerability. And if you're an autocrat, vulnerability is kryptonite.
Now, looking ahead, do you see then any potential for renewed internal challenges to Putin's authority, or has the rebellion's failure solidified his position?
I think it's a great question, and it's simply too early to know. I think in some ways, Putin, he reestablished parts of his regime to solidify his power. Generals who were sympathetic to Wagner Group got cashiered, they got fired. He's rearranged a lot of his generals in the past 6 months in the defense, in the Siloviki, the sort of the national security forces. But I think it really scared Putin. And I think that he faces criticisms from both the left and the right. The left, of course, have always been the Navalny's, et cetera. But the right think he's been too weak as well. He's let Prigozhin bully him around, et cetera. So I think the legacy of the Wagner Group, of Prigozhin, it's simply too early to know if Putin has consolidated power.
Now, we remember those pictures of Prigozhin being cheered as he was marching towards Moscow. What has happened with that support?
Well, as you know, with much popular support that is anti-establishment in Russia, it gets suppressed. And Prigozhin became a bit of a folk hero because he he embodied the voice of what many people thought in Russia, but were too timid to say. He was very critical of the war in Ukraine. He was very critical of the generals in the Russian military who ran the war. And so he became like this voice of the voiceless. And then when he disappeared, then all those voices either became very silent or they went to jail, as is true in any autocracy.
We can now speak to Kirill Shamiev. He's a political scientist and expert on Russian domestic politics, and he joins us from the Lithuanian capital, Vilnius. Welcome to DW. So we know that there are experts who say that Prigozhin's failed rebellion hasn't had any impact on Putin's grip on power. Do you agree with that assessment?
Thank you for having me. Yes, I agree with this assessment, and moreover, I would say that it only strengthens the Russian regime. Because in the authoritarian political system, what's worse than having no revolution is having a failed revolution. And what it means that the Kremlin learned the lessons. It analyzed weaker spots in the political and administrative system, and now it's stronger than it was before Prigozhin's mutiny. Because if you remember correctly, back a year ago, not a single member of the elite supported the mutiny. The military stayed in the barracks or on the front lines fighting the Ukrainians. And Prigozhin himself was such a person that not only irritated, actually scared members of the elite, because he was a very anti-elitist force, and he promised, to punish corrupt elites. And of course, people in Moscow were quite afraid of him. Now he's gone, and there's only Putin.
Well, you say the Kremlin learned from this failed rebellion. So is there any potential in the future for some sort of challenge to Putin's authority?
In my view, a lot depends on the situation on the front lines, the situation with the war against Ukraine. If the Kremlin does not achieve any significant political success in Ukraine, that will cause enormous shockwaves across the Russian political system, the military and security apparatus, because they have invested so much, including their lives, and achieving nothing would be a problem. For now, Russia is conducting offensive operations in Ukraine, and Ukraine is on defensive, and it shows that there is the stronger side is currently Russia, but we'll see what's going to happen next year.
Well, if we look back a year ago, there were many people who were cheering as Prigozhin and his Wagner forces were marching towards Moscow. So what has happened to all those people who showed support for this rebellion?
I would be careful to say that there were many people cheering for this, because Prigozhin was famous for having a very effective media empire and social media empire that was working to popularize his image, his figure, and to show him as a very famous, and successful politician and a military leader. And in fact, in the Rostov region, yes, there were people, bystanders, curious about what was happening. But later we saw the evidence that actually the majority of the population, the Rostov-on-Don is a big city, stayed at home and were actually terrified of what was happening. What's more important also in the authoritarian system is not just ordinary people, because they have no power in such a system, unlike in the members of the elite. And the two most important people in what was a private military company, Wagner, Prigozhin, its kind of political leader or its manager, civilian manager of the company, and its military head, the ninth Utkin. He was. Both of them were killed when the aircraft was exploded over Russia's territory. So this kind of ended the history of Wagner under Prigozhin and Putin.
That was Kirill Shamiev. Thank you so much for all of your insights.